They boarded a plane in Rio de Janeiro. They fastened their seatbelts. Some ordered drinks. Some closed their eyes. Some watched films and laughed and had no idea that within hours, every single one of them would be gone. 228 people. A modern aircraft. Experienced pilots. And a night sky over the Atlantic Ocean that would swallow them whole, leaving the world with nothing but silence, debris, and questions that would take 2 years to answer. This is the true story of Air France Flight 447, and by the time you finish watching this, you will never look at a plane the same way again. On June 1, 2009, Flight 447 lifted off from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, bound for Paris, France. It was a route flown safely hundreds of times before. The aircraft was an Airbus A330, one of the most advanced commercial jets in the world at the time, regarded as a symbol of modern aviation safety. The crew was experienced. The passengers were ordinary people, businessmen and women, families, tourists, all settling in for a long overnight flight across the Atlantic. Everything about this night felt completely routine. That is what makes what happened next so deeply terrifying. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed, the captain, Marc Dubois, did something completely normal for a long-haul flight. He handed the cockpit over to his two co-pilots, Pierre-Cedric Bonin and David Robert, and went to the crew rest area for a scheduled sleep break. Thousands of flights operate this way every single day. There was nothing unusual about it. The two men left in charge were trained professionals sitting inside one of the safest aircraft ever built, cruising at 38,000 feet above the ocean. Nothing about this moment suggested catastrophe. Then, at exactly 2:10 in the morning, something changed. The aircraft entered a region of the Atlantic Ocean known for severe weather, a stretch of storm systems near the equator where towering thunderclouds can reach the upper limits of the atmosphere. The pilots adjusted their course slightly to navigate around the worst of it, but they were still flying through turbulence, lightning, and freezing air. And in that freezing air, something small happened. Something that should never have been fatal. The aircraft's airspeed sensors, small external probes called pitot tubes, became blocked by ice crystals. Within seconds, the sensors began sending incorrect speed data to the cockpit instruments. The autopilot system, which depends entirely on accurate speed readings to function, could no longer trust what it was seeing. So it did what it was designed to do. It switched off. It handed control back to the pilots. A warning tone sounded in the cockpit, and in that instant, everything changed. Pierre-Cedric Bonin, sitting in the right seat, took the controls. The aircraft was flying normally. There was no emergency yet. The engines were working. The plane was intact. All that had failed were 3 small sensors. But what happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most studied and heartbreaking sequences of events in the history of aviation. As Bonin took manual control, he did something that investigators would later struggle to fully explain. He pulled back on the control stick, pointing the nose of the aircraft upward. The plane began to climb. But without accurate speed data, neither pilot realized that the aircraft was already slowing down dangerously. As the nose rose higher and the speed dropped lower, the wings began to lose their ability to generate lift. Then the stall warning activated. A stall in aviation has nothing to do with the engine stopping. It is a condition where the wings are no longer cutting through the air at the correct angle to produce lift. When a stall occurs, the correct response is direct and clear. Push the nose down, allow the aircraft to accelerate, recover the airflow over the wings, and climb again once flying speed is restored. Every pilot in the world is trained to do this. It is one of the most fundamental lessons in all of aviation. But inside that cockpit, in complete darkness, surrounded by storm clouds, with instruments sending conflicting signals and a warning alarm filling the air, that fundamental lesson was not applied. The nose stayed up. And the aircraft kept falling. David Robert, the more senior co-pilot, called out for the captain. Du Bois rushed back into the cockpit, still groggy, trying to understand what he was seeing. But the data on the screens was inconsistent, the warnings were layered on top of each other, and the aircraft was already in a deep stall. Descending at a rate that was invisible to the crew because the nose of the aircraft was still pointing upward. The plane looked like it was climbing. But it was falling. It was falling at nearly 11,000 feet per minute, and the crew did not fully understand it until it was far too late. At one point during the descent, the stall warning briefly went silent. Not because the stall was over, but because the speed data had become so unreliable that the system stopped triggering. That silence may have reinforced the pilots' confusion, making them believe the situation was different from what it truly was. The aircraft continued to fall. 38,000 feet. 30,000. 20,000. The ocean was rising toward them in the darkness and they could not see it. Then, in the final seconds, one of the pilots spoke words that were later recovered from the cockpit voice recorder. Words that have stayed with investigators, journalists, and aviation experts ever since. He said, quietly, "We are going to crash. This cannot be happening." At 2:14 in the morning, Air France Flight 447 struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at high speed. There were no survivors. All 228 people on board were killed instantly. For days, search teams combed the ocean surface and found floating debris, luggage, seat cushions, and fragments of the aircraft, confirming the worst. But the main wreckage, along with the black box flight recorders that held the key to understanding what truly happened, had sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic, nearly 4,000 meters below the surface. For nearly 2 years, the ocean held its secrets. Families grieved without answers. Investigators searched without results. The world waited. Then in 2011, after multiple search campaigns using deep-sea submarines and sonar technology, the wreckage was finally located on the ocean floor. The black boxes were recovered. And when investigators played back the data and the cockpit voice recordings, the picture became painfully clear. The crash was not caused by one single catastrophic failure. It was caused by a chain of small events, each one building on the last. Frozen sensors led to autopilot disconnection. Disconnection led to confusion. Confusion led to the wrong control input. The wrong input led to a stall. And the stall was never corrected. In the months and years that followed, the aviation industry responded with sweeping changes. Airlines worldwide began replacing older pitot tube designs with upgraded versions less vulnerable to ice blockage. Regulatory bodies updated pilot training programs to include high-altitude manual flying and stall recovery in conditions that simulate automation failure. The lesson was clear and painful. In a world where aircraft have become so automated, so computerized, so capable of flying themselves, there is a very real risk that pilots lose the raw instinctive feel for flying manually. And when automation fails suddenly, in darkness, in a storm, at 38,000 feet, the gap between training and instinct can become the difference between life and death. But beyond the technical investigation and the regulatory reforms, this story carries something deeper. It is a story about what happens when human beings face information they do not fully understand, when the systems they trust suddenly stop making sense, when the pressure of a moment strips away everything except raw decision and instinct. 3 trained professionals, in one of the safest aircraft ever built, over an ocean that gave them no landmarks and no reference, confronted a situation that gave them conflicting signals in less than 4 minutes to respond. They were not reckless. They were not negligent in the ordinary sense of the word. They were overwhelmed. And in that overwhelm, a fundamental response was delayed until the ground, or in this case the ocean, made the decision for them. For the families of the 228 people who never came home, answers came 2 years too late. But the changes that followed their loss have quietly saved lives that those families will never know about. Every pilot today who trains for manual stall recovery at altitude carries the lesson of Flight 447 inside that training, even if they never speak the name. Every upgraded pitot tube fitted to a modern aircraft exists in part because of what happened on that night over the Atlantic. That is the strange and heavy reality of tragedy. Sometimes the worst moments in history become the reason the next disaster never happens. What would you do if everything you trusted suddenly stopped working? If the instruments you depended on began to contradict each other, if the situation made no sense, if the darkness around you gave you nothing to hold on to, would you know what to do? Or would confusion take over before clarity arrived? This is not simply a story about a crash. It is a story about the fragility of certainty, about how quickly order can become chaos, and about why the fundamentals matter even more when everything advanced stops working. Because sometimes the difference between recovery and disaster comes down to a single moment, a single input, a single decision made in the dark. If this story held your attention from beginning to end, subscribe to this channel right now, because true stories drop every day.